Hello family, Danny here, and today we are going to talk about one of my favorite films, and that would be 1987's Hellraiser, directed by Clive Barker, and it is based on one of my favorite novellas, The Hellbound Heart by Mr. Clive Barker. And just to let you guys know, there is also a sequel. The Scarlet Gospel's also very good. But today, let's dive right into it. We are talking about the classic film, Hellraiser. And if you have not seen this classic, I suggest that you go watch it. It's available on quite a few platforms. I know, I think Prime, Shudder, it's there. I would go watch it and then come back because we are going to definitely be getting into some spoilers. So let's jump right in. This movie was a hit. It was shot on a shoestring budget, much like one of my favorite film franchises as well, which that would be The Evil Dead, Sam Raimi's The Evil Dead. Now, there are 10 Hellraisers. And in my humble opinion, the first one is classic, flawless. The second one is pretty good. And from there, it gets a little murky. Doug Bradley, who plays the notorious Pinhead, and we'll get into the history of that, was not, I think, only in 8 of them. So they made a newer one this year. No, I think it was 22. But we're not getting into that. We're going to talk about this one. So let's talk about cast, shall we? And who we're focusing on, what couple we're focusing on, because this is couples month, right? Also, Valentine's Day is coming up. If you're watching this, when I'm recording this, Valentine's Day is actually tomorrow. And, wherever you are, I want you guys to have fun with horror, because there's always romance in horror, whether it's fun, young, old, crazy, new, it's there. So we'll also be focusing on, and we'll let you guys know, we'll be doing little kisses and love bites, depending on what you're interested in. And we'll be focusing on different couples throughout the month, such as Nancy and Glenn from Nightmare on Elm Street and the Warrens in the Conjuring universe. So that'll be fun too. But back to Hellraiser, right? So we have Larry and Julia, first couple. Larry is played by Andrew Robinson, who is a great, great, great character actor. He's one of those people you've seen in a zillion things. One of his famous roles is Scorpio in the Dirty Harry film. Claire Higgins, who's a great English actress. The other couple we'll be focusing on is also Claire Higgins and Frank, Larry's brother, who is portrayed by Sean Chapman. And rounding out, this cast that we'll be kind of focusing on right now, at least, is Kirsty, who is Larry's daughter. And she is portrayed by Ashley Lawrence. I loved her. This was her first role, and she was just perfect. I mean, she was nice and caring, but she also was strong and very smart, quick on her feet. And she really I like to say that line between, where she can really help us to suspend our disbelief. So it's like she's also vulnerable, but she's also strong, but not too much of each. I thought she was great. So when things get a little bit more far-fetched, it just seems right. You believe her, you believe in her, and you are definitely rooting for her, throughout this. So let's see, how do we open up in Hellraiser? Well, we open up where Frank is somewhere, somewhere in Asia, and he's talking to this guy, and he's making a bargain. He's like, give me the box. And there's this part where he slams the money down with his hand, and his fingernails are notoriously dirty. A lot of people talked about this. And, he puts the money down, and he gets the box. And as he's leaving, the guy he gets it from says, take it, it's yours. And he says, it always was. So next scene we cut to, he is in this almost empty, attic-like room. He's on a mattress, and he's fiddling with this box. Now, through this, we're going to be talking about some of the differences between the book and the film. it's kind of like if you've read the True Blood series, right? And you watch the HBO version, you know that there are differences, but they kind of come together to make sense, and the differences add to it. And so also, if the characters are more obviously fleshed out in a novella, so it helps, especially when you have the director is the writer, to kind of flesh things out. So we'll be kind of interspersed in that. So he goes back. He's fiddling with the box. We don't really know too much about it at this point. And all of a sudden, it's like we hear these light bells. And then we kind of see shadows appear of the Cenobites. We don't know anything about them at this point. And next thing you know, these hooks come out and kind of like, skin. And then he kind of disappears into the mattress. And so in the book, obviously, that we're told who the Cenobites are at this point. We're told that, Frank had been searching for this box, that he had heard rumors of it and a little bit of the history of it. So just, I'm kind of interspersed in that because I highly recommend the book as well. So, we get a little bit more detail at that point. But in the film, we kind of flash back to Larry and Julia walking into his house. And immediately we see that things are kind of rocky between this couple. She doesn't look too happy as she's walking in. She kind of has a scowl on her face, and he's doing his best to be, eager, to be encouraging, to be hopeful. And so he's telling her, I don't care about this stuff. And we find out that it was his grandmother's house he inherited after she passed away. And he's basically like, I don't care about this stuff. It is, you can do whatever you want to the house. It doesn't matter to me. And so Julia asked him, what about your brother Frank? And so Larry's like, well, he's probably off somewhere doing whatever, and he's never been one to kick money out of bed. Now, let me stop for a second, too, to talk about wardrobe, because wardrobe, everything in this film comes together. The lighting, the wardrobe, the makeup, everything. Like, there's so much, like, we really see how all the moving pieces in a film function to create this wonderful, magical piece of art. So not only are they acting markedly different, their clothing is different. Their style is different. He's just very nondescriptive. He does nothing really, stands out. Almost a little sloppy, I would say, where she's really, well coiffed, her hair, her makeup, all the way down to her clothing, to her shoes. This is a put together woman. So even aesthetically, these two are dramatically different. So she's going about the house exploring, and she finds these pictures. Now, in the movie, she's looking through these pictures, and she sees Frank, and, it's kind of like, And then she sees he's with a young lady in some compromising positions, and kind of we get like a little facial change there. Like, she's not too happy. So we're getting, some hints of what's going on. So she tears the young lady's part of the picture out so she can just have his picture. So I'm like, oh, okay. So while she's doing that, Kirsty comes, and we immediately get the sense that there's tension between these two. We do know she's a stepmom, and they, we know this because, when one of the moving men says, she looks like her mom to Larry, he's like, her mother's, not here anymore. So we automatically see this tension. Julia doesn't look too happy to see her. Now let's stop for a second and get into the differences in the book. This is one thing that's markedly different in the book. First off, Larry's name is Rory in the book, and also Kirsty is not his daughter. She's a friend who's known him for a while and has a crush on him. And I think it was a great decision for Clive Barker to change that because, that connection between father and daughter and how the chemistry between Andrew Robinson and Ashley Lawrence was so on point that it just you really understood the emotional investment that they had together and the connection that they had. And, it makes other events that come later mean more to you, I think, than if it was just someone that he worked with or knew and kind of had a crush on him. So there's that. But we see this friction early on. So while she's trying to make some coffee, tea to help or whatever, and Julia's downstairs kind of mooning over Frank, Well, as Larry is moving the couch and he cuts himself. And surprise, surprise, he's very skittish. He's scared of blood. And so he actually goes all the way up the stairs with this cut. He's dripping blood everywhere to tell her, I can't look at it. I can't see. You know how I am about blood. And she's already got the look, the demeanor. She's not a helpful wife at all. Not even a helpful friend. She seems frustrated with him. She's telling him, you're going to be all right, but you probably need stitches. He's like, oh my gosh, I'm going to faint. And she's like, no, you're not. Like, she's just like totally like, ugh. So they go to the hospital. They wind up, she's like, got to go to the hospital. So they close the door. But as they close the door, this blood that seeped down on the floor, and this great special effect, it kind of like evaporates, and we hear little critters scurrying around. And then Frank, rises up. We see these arms, and we find out later it's Frank. Another thing we also find out is that, the flashback that Julia has Claire Higgins of her time with Frank, because we learned that Brother Frank had came to visit like a week before the wedding, and he's knocking on the door and coming in through the rain. And, Frank is like very good looking. He's totally the opposite of his brother. He's got that, oh, he's so dreamy look, what you would see in a magazine or something. He's the total opposite, body shape, face, everything. And so she's like, and so this results in this encounter. Now, it doesn't really seem in the film the way it's portrayed romantic. Clive Barker talked about it in the documentary, how they actually had to tone it down, and it was, much more, provocative scene than what we saw. But in the book, it's described as almost a forceful encounter, except consent was given. So we're already seeing this juxtaposition between pain and pleasure and the connection and the fine line. And so they have this like really, almost violent encounter. And like I said in the book, Frank is a very well-seasoned person who is, he talks about how he's been everything, been everywhere, seen everything. And the whole thing of seduction and pleasure, it's gotten boring to him. And so even in this exchange, in this love thing with Julia, which I say love thing is in her mind, when he goes to leave, she's like, no, don't go. And he's like, it's never enough. And she's like, I'll do anything for you. And he's like, anything? And she's like, anything. And you're kind of thinking, okay, wait a minute. This is your soon-to-be husband's brother. You just slept with him once, and now you're telling him you'll do anything for him. And it just, again, we see the power of sex and how like all these things can get murky and mired in your mind. And she basically blows this exchange up, romanticizes it rather, to where it's just, this passionate love affair when it was just this one-time thing. And she even in the book, thinks back to in a flashback in her mind as to when her marriage went downhill, her feelings for Larry changed, and she attributes it to that day. And we, like I said, again, we see that in the film. We just don't get all the exposition, but the characters really portray that. So he goes to the hospital. Like I said, they're having this dinner. And, Julia's like just sitting there at the table, and you could tell, she's just like, these people, I just want to go to bed. He's going on and on about how the doctor was poking around with all the compassion of Joseph Mengele, and he's being very dramatic, telling this story like he got resuscitated from the jaws of death or something. And she just kind of stands up and is like, I'm ready to go upstairs and I'm not feeling well. And he's looking at her like, okay, you okay? But also kind of like, oh, here she goes again with this, And instead of, he doesn't like, the guests are like, okay, that's probably time for us to go, which most people would kind of think if you're at a dinner party and there's, a hostess and a host and, the other partner's like, I'm tired. I'm ready to go. Most people do. And he's like, no, everybody stay. So the party continues. She goes upstairs. And when she goes upstairs, she goes into that room. And in the book, we're told that she's drawn to that room. But, we see that in the film that for some reason she keeps going back to this empty, decrepit room. And she's standing in there and Frank whispers to her, and she sees this thing, and it's like he's not fully developed. He doesn't have skin. It's like he's just like bone with, cartilage or arteries kind of developed. And he doesn't want her to look at him. And he says, I'm Frank. And she doesn't believe it. And he's like, no, it's really me. And he doesn't really tell her at this point what's going on. But he does tell her, I need the blood. The blood brought me back. And she's like, what? He's like, the blood, I need more. And so she knows what he means, that there's only one way to obtain blood. And so she kind of goes, we see like, she closes the door, and it's like we get this little few minutes like she thinks about it, but she doesn't think about it too long. She's down for this because she wants to get him back. She loves him. So again, wardrobe, like, when she gets into the mode of this seduction and bringing him this blood, her whole style, it goes up above, like up a notch, right? Like if she was platinum, when she goes into this mode, this, Black Widow mode, she's diamond. So the makeup changes, it gets more pronounced. Her hair gets more puffed up. It's like that 80s style, more severe. Her clothing is more kind of like a Coco Chanel almost. And so it's like her whole persona changed, even though when she walks, is very confident, very cool, just sitting at the bar, sipping her drink and trying to entice these men, which, by the way, she doesn't have a difficult time doing because Claire Higgins is a beautiful woman. And like I said, the makeup and the way they made her up, she's almost boy-like in this movie. And she's got a little feminine and masculine. There's a lot, of gender fluid stuff going on in this film. And they talk about that in the book too, that, it's hard when Frank initially sees the Cenobites to see, what exactly, are they male or female, or how he should address them. So, at this point, where he is like, okay, so she's going about her Black Widow thing. She brings the first guy back, and Frank, she, proceeds, he tells her to leave and go, she kind of sets us up. It's kind of like, bowling, right? You set up the pins and somebody else knocks them down. So they do that. And then he kind of sucks them dry, and it's like, you see her shaking. She hasn't seen, she goes in the bathroom. She's kind of shaking. The second one, she's more cool about it. She's getting comfortable with this. We see her like, it's kind of like, okay, I was a little shaky on that first one, but now I'm solid. And by the third one, she's really ready to go. And there's an amazing scene, I got to say this, at a certain point where she's sitting there with Larry and they're watching a fight, and he's all like, yeah. And he looks over at her, and she's like kind of bored, and he looks at her and he's like, are you okay? And she's like, yeah. And he said, but you usually don't like this kind of stuff. And she's like, I've seen worse. And so we know what she's talking about, but obviously he doesn't, right? So he's seeing a change in her because they have this, while this fight scene takes place, Frank, he's not whole yet, right? Like there's a lovely scene where he's smoking a cigarette and he's like, I can taste this now. Yeah, I can feel, things. And in the book, he talks about, sensing things and smelling things. So, he's getting his 5 senses back, right? And so he's like, I need one more, and I'll be finished. And she's kind of like, So, he's up there, like, basically having a temper tantrum while she's downstairs with Larry. And he wants to go up there and check it out. And she doesn't want that. At this point, even though she doesn't love him, she doesn't quite want him to go, but wants him to go. So she's still like, there's a little piece of humanity left in there. So she kind of tries to distract him by using her sex appeal. And she winds up taking him up there. And then Frank, kind of, you know, is coming with a knife in his hand, and she's like, no, no, no. And now Larry's like, I don't know what to think. And she's like, obviously saying no, 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 like she's distressed. And, you know, then she keeps saying, no, please don't, I can't bear it. And so, you know, Frank retreats, and, you know, Larry's like, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do with you. You know, one minute you want to be with me, one minute you don't. So there's a lot of confusion because he really, really, really wants this marriage to work. So he goes out to a lunch with Kirsty, and he's talking to Kirsty about it. And he tells Kirsty, you know, maybe you can talk to her, you know, and Kirsty's like, I don't really want to talk to this lady. I don't like her, but it's like, this is my dad. I love him. If this is going to make him happy, then I'm going to do it. So she goes to talk to her, but as she's walking up their walkway sidewalk, she sees Julia like kind of sneaking in like a side door or something with a guy. So she's like, wait a minute, what's going on? You know? So she decides to see. So she kind of sneaks in the house. And she hears, when she comes in, it's kind of like the end, you know, of this, you know. So like the end of the murder. So she sees, you know, Frank, but she doesn't know who he is. And he's like, come to daddy, come to daddy. And he says this in this really, really, really creepy way. And so she's freaking out because this thing is coming at her, which anybody would freak out, right? So she sees the box. And so she goes to pick the box up, and he's like, wait a minute. No, no, put that down, put that down. And she's like, you want it? And she's like, give it to me now. And she's like, well, then take it. And she chucks it out the window and she runs away. She passes out. She winds up in this hospital. There's this creepy, creepy, creepy doctor who, you know, he gives her the box back, and he says, like, you were clutching on to this for dear life, and maybe, you know, this will help you out. Like this really like cheese eating grin. And so she's like, whatever, you know. So she sits down on a bed and she starts fiddling with it, and it starts moving, and levers and all these things. And all of a sudden there's these lights, and the walls are like pulsating. And long story short, here come the Cenobites. Now we really get a good look at him. We see there's one called the Chatterer. He's kind of rotund, and he's got these teeth, which is really funny because the guy who plays him is really good looking and really small. He was also in Nightbreed. And then there is Butterball, which I'm sorry, I mixed that up. I should know this. Butterball was portrayed by the guy who was in Nightbreed. And then there's the female Cenobite, which we do have somebody attributed as that, like I said, but in the book, they're described as more androgynous is the word that is used. And then we have Pinhead. Now, a lot of people wonder if they don't know, you know, why was he called Pinhead? Well, initially they did use pins, but they found they could not see them. So then they wound up using nails, but the name stuck. But in the credits, he's not Pinhead. In the credits of Hellraiser, he is just the lead Cenobite. And let's talk about how these people look. It is like, just to see these people rise up and be in your living room would be crazy. They have, you know, Pinhead himself, you know, there's all these pins all over his head, all these nails all over his face. There's, you know, his clothes are sewn to him where you don't know where the clothes begin and the skin ends. He's wearing a priestly vestment, which is very priestly-like vestment, which is very interesting because in, you know, Scarlet Gospels, he's called the Hell Priest. And Jane Wildgoose, who did the wardrobe, and I said we're going to talk about because all this comes together. She said that when she met with Clive Barker, and I'll be posting on my Instagram some of the drawings, he wanted, like, there was talk of body modification, S&M themes, not knowing where the clothes begin and the skin ended, a butcher-like demeanor, and she uses a word that I love that, you know, it makes me feel like Daryl Hannah in Kill Bill, where she talked about how she loved the word gargantuan and always wanted to use it. Well, she uses these two words, repulsive glamour. I'm like, I love that, right? So that's what they wanted. Also with the makeup, Clive Barker stressed that he wanted to be able to see Doug Bradley's face, his eyes, and his facial expressions. He didn't want the makeup to overpower him. And interesting fact, Doug Bradley and Clive Barker are best friends. They've known each other since I think like 14 or 15. They went to school together, and he actually had the choice to be either one of the movers in the beginning of the movie or the lead Cenobite. And he chose lead Cenobite, and movie history was made. So just a little background on that. So when you see these people, it's off-putting. There's a cut, like a flap in the middle of the female Cenobite's, throat. Stomachs are cut open. You can see pulled open with levers. And, when they did the wardrobe and the makeup, they studied a lot of body modification books, magazines where you could see pictures of all these things. And so, and that was really big. And the look, like I said, is very S&M, very, just jarring. It's very, very jarring. So she's freaking out. She's looking at these people, and she's like, or these things, she doesn't know what they are. And he's like, you solved the box, so we came. And she's like, it was an accident. And he's like, it doesn't matter. You got to come. Like in the novel, they're like, okay, this has happened before. People have done this by accident, but guess what? You still got to come with us. And she immediately, and this is like, I'm like, this girl thinks well under pressure, because she's like, I'm going to bargain with these people, so these things rather. So she's like, you've done this before. And he's like, many, many times. And she's like, okay, to a man named Frank. And they're like, yeah, so what of it? What does that have to do with you? And he's like, he escaped you. And Pinhead says, no one escapes us. And she said, I've seen him. I've seen him. And, he tells her, basically, if you can prove this, we might let you go. But if not, we have the immortal line, we'll tear your soul apart. And there's so many good lines. No more tears. It's a waste of good suffering. Demons to some, angels to others. There's so many good lines. Go on, but trick us again, child, and your suffering will be legendary even in hell. He's not even really kind of like the star of this movie, but he stole it, because Julia is like very, very evil what this woman is doing. But, this Doug Bradley just ran off with this movie, right? So she kind of makes this like tentative bargain. Meanwhile, Julia's at home talking to brother Frank, and she's like, she's going to tell everything. And he's like, basically, who's going to believe her? And she's like, well, we got to go. And that's when he tells her the story of the Cenobites and how he was looking for pleasure and he found it. And in the book, it's funny because he talks about, because everything with him was basically sex, the physical pleasures, things he could taste, touch, feel. So he kind of thought it was just going to be that. He didn't realize that it was going to be that flip side, that basically the same feelings and nerves and endings and emotions, they were going to heighten it up by mixing in that pain with it. And so he tells her the story and how he escaped them and the blood brought him back and all this. And, she's like, okay, well, she's still like, we got to go. And he's like, well, how can I go like this? I still need, I got to get myself together. So Larry comes home and Julia's like, you know what? There's something I got to tell you, but basically you got to see it. Cause he's like, what's wrong? And she's like, you got to see it. And so we don't actually kind of see what happens, but her love, her lust, her romanticizing of this toxic relationship, leads her to, set her husband up, for this big fall. And so Frank, he's the last person. And so he takes upon his skin, his face. So meanwhile, Kirsty's, on her way back and she's knocking on the door and she's like, I want to see my dad. I want to see my dad. And Julia's, telling her, come on in then. And basically, and this is where we get, I got to stop, great acting, because Andrew Robinson's performance, like, all up to this point as Larry, he's playing a kind of like this goofy guy, a little bit irritating. It's like, we don't want to root against him, and there's parts where you kind of feel like I would be irritated with this guy too. You know, he really does a good job of playing that, but he's sitting there in the chair and he's like in front of the mirror, like in the bedroom, and he's kind of checking himself out. And we know it's Frank in there, but Kirsty doesn't. And it's just, he does such a good job at being Frank and Larry merged together, so to speak. And so he's telling her everything's going to be okay. And she's like, how is it? And he's like, well, Julia told me everything and we got it under control. You know, I got rid of Uncle Frank, and then, you know, we'll find a way to explain this to the police and smooth it over. And she's like, I don't believe this. And so basically, you know, Frank tells Julia, show her. So she walks up the stairs and she sees the body. And there's this really, it's like Pinhead kind of rises up like almost out of nowhere, and all the Cenobites are behind him, and he's pointing, and she can see like her dad's face like on the ground, and he's pointing. He's like, you know, give me the man who did this. And she's like, no, that's my dad. That wasn't part of the deal, because she still doesn't get it. And then she runs out of the room, and Julia's standing in front of the door trying to block her way. And it's like, no. And then Frank is kind of trying to calm her down. But then he's like, you know what? He slips up and he says, come to daddy. And she remembers that he had said that to her in their first encounter. And also he says it in a creepy way that's totally not father-like at all, that, you know, a different type of daddy. So she's creeped out by it. So she knows it's, you know, Frank. And so there's a struggle, and he has a knife, and long story short, he sticks Julie. He's like, sorry, babe, because his investment in this relationship was not like hers was. He had none. You know, she was just another person, somebody to use, you know, a mean to an ends, where she looked at him as freedom. She talks about in the book how she helped rebuild him by bringing these men to him. And then she has this marriage. She had this marriage where she felt unfulfilled. But I don't think, you know, even in the movie and the book, my perception was she didn't really have the greatest intentions anyway. But at one point she did have some kind of, you know, feeling for him, maybe even if it was infatuation, or she thought she might develop it, but it took a turn. So we have like, and then Larry on his side, you know, is coming into this like, I really love this woman. I want to do anything to make it work. So we got these two people, one who has, you know, he's holding on to a love that he really doesn't have, and that would be Larry. Julia is trying to obtain and, you know, maintain a love that she never really had. And Frank is just like out for himself. So we've got all this going on. So, you know, at this point in the film, Julia's like on the ground, on the stairs. And Frank is like, you know, no more cat and mouse game. You know, let's do it. You know, I'm going to take pretense off. You know, it's me. So let's rock. So she runs, you know, she's trying to get away from him. And then, you know, he hears she goes and she sees her father. They run into that little creepy attic room, and she sees him, and she's crying, and she's like, Dad. And he's like, don't warn him. He was dead a long time ago, you know, and he states his name. And at that point, the Cenobites appear because, you know, and the female Cenobite says, we had to hear it from your own lips. And they tell Kirsty, get out. This isn't for your eyes. And Kirsty's like, okay, you don't got to tell me twice. I'm out of here. And Frank's like, you set me up. And next thing you know, we get this crazy scene where he's getting all the hooks and his face is peeled off, you know, and it's just crazy. He says another line that a lot of people quote from the movie, which is actually a Bible quote. He says, Jesus wept. And at that point, you know, his head kind of explodes, and Kirsty's like trying to run away. And as she's running, next thing you know, we get Pinhead rising up again, and like, we have such sights to show you. And Kirsty's like, So he's telling her, no, don't fiddle with it. Now, Kirsty has a little boyfriend who shows up at this point. He's kind of like, you know, he does come at one point to, you know, help her. He goes to visit her in the hospital, but he's not like super important, but he's on the scene in this, and they're both running out of here and everything. And, and they run out, and the house kind of like, she's solving it as she goes. And the house kind of like, collapses in upon itself. Right. And as they're out, they're like walking, and there's like a bonfire, and Kirsty worked at like a pet store, and there was this like creepy guy who came in one day, and he's eating bugs. And so she sees this creepy guy again, and he kind of turns into like a dragon and just like takes the cube. And then the movie ends with another man like talking to a man and making that same bargain that Frank did. So let's unpack this a little bit. This movie was so impactful, like not, the look, the type of character, like, in the 80s, we had Jason was really big, Michael Myers was on the scene. It was a big slasher era. And then there were so many countless ones that we could go on that, didn't become big franchises, but it was a big market for slashers. But Pinhead was different. He stole the show because he had this quiet, like I would say almost like a quiet, gentlemanly like demeanor. Their looks were so shocking. And his film was very raw. Like when you look at the scene between Frank and Julie, it's really, really, really raw. And there's a lot of emotion between all those characters. Julia and Kirsty, Claire Higgins and Ashley Lawrence, respectively. Ashley Lawrence talks about in commentary how Claire Higgins was very aloof and not really mean, but didn't mingle with her a lot. And that helped to create kind of like almost like a real tension between them, that resulted in what we got. Andrew Robinson, like I said, is always on point. And just like I said, the look and just the dialogue in this film, it was very human. Even though we had this supernatural aspect, it was very human in these emotions, because you had a man, like I said, who loved a woman, and, a woman who wanted things. I think she was very confused, and a super villain. And then a spunky young girl were thrown into the mix. And there was just so much. It was very controversial, and you couldn't really say that anything was like Hellraiser. Like, I don't think there's anything that was out then that you could say, okay, yeah, this is kind of exactly like that. It just was so different for its time. And like I said, the style of dress was phenomenal. Everything, just all these different elements, just converged together. But I really thought, like I said, the human dynamics was something I think that made us all too emotionally invested in this film. It was kind of like if I compare it to anything, I would say it reminded me almost of a Stephen King story, because if you read Stephen King, or even if you've seen any of his films, there's always, his characters are so rich and you're so connected to them that when the supernatural things happen, they're believable, and you want these characters to make it. You want these relationships to work. And it's like you do have two different stories. You have a human story and you have the supernatural story. And I think in the best horror, those things come together. This film, like I said, spawned like a lot of sequels. To me, I feel like a lot of people, discuss Halloween, but I feel like too with Hellraiser, there were just a lot of things. I think Hellraiser, Halloween, Texas Chainsaw were, franchises that at a certain point, things kind of did go a little bit, I'd say, off the rails. But if you're looking for something that, will scare you, give you a lot to think about, maybe even spark some new interest for you, who knows? Hellraiser is one that I would highly, highly recommend. So I will see you guys soon. I want you to enjoy your Valentine's Day. If you're looking at it before, if you're looking at it after, I hope you had a great one. Like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments, what you thought. And again, any suggestions or any couples that you might want to see. And as always, stay different. Bye.